Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Krashy, and today I wanted to do a bit of a discussion video. It's going to be slightly different though, because I have a lot of questions for y'all. But I wanted to do a bit of a discussion video talking about the defender role in Pokemon Unite, and more specifically, the viability of defenders. Now, I know whenever I talk about this game and the meta and my kind of like analysis of the game and stuff, I really do bring the perspective of like 5 stacking and competitive, and like what I like to think of as like more of like the actual meta as opposed to what can happen in solo queue. Because if I'm being honest, in solo queue or just like in ranked in general, you can pretty much play anything and it'll work just fine. But I want to pull up the list of defenders. So we have Blastoise, Crustle, Greedent, Mamoswine, Slowbro, and Snorlax. And, you know, realistically, if you're looking at like the competitive scene or 5 stacking, of that entire list of 6 defenders, you really get about one of those that it's like meta worthy, and that's Snorlax. Blastoise undeniably is going to be a close second because Blastoise just has a ridiculous amount of CC with Surf, Hydro Pump, and then his Unite move. And I would say Greedent kind of fits in its own little category. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a second, but Greedent really does sit in like this whole side category. And you see a lot of Greedent played in like the Japanese meta, but more or less as far as being like a frontline tank, you're not going to see a ton of Greedent in the meta. So Greedent kind of just his own little thing in his own little world there. I think as far as the battle types themselves go, so like calling something an all-rounder, an attacker, defender, me and Spraggles had actually talked about this a little bit in the past. I really feel like these battle type classifications are just meant to put characters in these little boxes based on their statistics. So characters that have like high health and defense, and you know, they're just trying to angle these characters in a specific way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are just like 100% full-on frontline tanks, right? Greedent being a defender is tanky, is hard to, you know, take down or knock out, but is not necessarily someone that's just going to be standing in front of the team and always doing damage. It's going to be very disruptive in that sense. So, you know, I talk a little bit about the all-rounder problem and issues with the all-rounders that I think is still mostly prevalent in the game now, but what is the issue with defenders? So, when comparing Pokemon Unite to other MOBAs, you know, one thing that other MOBAs have is the way that they farm and earn experience during the laning phase. Now, if you're not too familiar with other MOBAs and how they work, essentially, you know, minions, or I guess in this situation would be like wild Pokemon, would rush down the lane in like a line, and they would clash in the center of the lane, and then you have to fight over the opposing Pokemon, like the opposing players, to secure the farm and try to deny them from securing your farm. In Pokemon Unite, we have very static camps, and this is a very, very unique laning mechanic to pretty much any MOBA I've ever played. You have these static camps, the Ice Qs, the Aldinos, the Apoms, things of that nature, and you have to essentially fight over them. So when it comes to what makes a good laner, people ask me this every now and then, what makes a good laner? Well, what makes a good laner is the ability to secure farm and the ability to trade damage. So for example, if I could jump over to a different class really quickly, the support class, when comparing something like Eldegoss to Blissey, well, I think in this situation, the reason why, or at least part of the reason why Eldegoss is so prominent over Blissey in the meta, is because Eldegoss is a range support, can do range damage for securing farm and shooting out leafage in the early game to try to secure farm, but also can damage trade by being ranged. Whereas Blissey has her pound and she has to step into like melee range to be able to use that, and then has like a small heal, but is melee range and doesn't really get as much tangible value. You can't use a muscle band on Blissey and get in and damage trade, and ultimately Blissey just kind of falls behind. So, at least in the 1-1-3 meta. So, tanks, it's the same thing, the defender role. How do you have a viable defender? Well, you have to have someone that can secure farm. And if you're looking at the majority of the defenders, they're not really that great at that. You do have Snorlax, who has his boosted auto and tackle. That is really, really good at securing farm. But other than that, outside maybe Mamoswine, who I think Mamoswine is actually creeping up in the meta quite a bit. The changes to Mamoswine's Unite move at level 9 and just the evolutions getting their abilities 1 level earlier is actually a really big change. I think it's really big for Snorlax too. But unfortunately, I think in Mamoswine's case, he just falls off a little bit too much in late game. And it's not even that bad. It's really not. But I think that's the reason that's holding Mamoswine back. I think if they were to buff Mamoswine's late game a little bit, or the Unite move, it would be really interesting to see how meta that character could be. But overall, we have, Blastoise with like Water Gun and Hydro Pump. It's just not the best secure for farm. You have Crustle and Slowbro. They don't really have the best securing for farm. And then again, you have Greedent, who again, he's kind of in his own little category. I actually think that Greedent's pretty decent at like solo top lane, although you're not going to really see that in the meta too much unless you're in like the Japanese meta, because you just have a lot of Lucario players here in like North America, or in most metas. I think you have a lot of Lucario players. So what's the problem? How do we fix it? Well, I think the problem is for sure that it's just harder for them to secure farm. And maybe the solution is not forcing 1-1-3. It's finding a way to play, 2-2 lanes or 2-1-2, and having these other kinds of tanks provide pressure in other lanes against the solo lane. But all in all, we're just seeing a really interesting trend. And usually whenever I bring up topics like this and I have like my thoughts on like what isn't working or what needs to be changed, I'll try to bring some kind of solution. But that's where this video is a little bit different, because I don't really have a huge solution. I have an idea, and I'm going to bring it up here in a second, but I really want to ask y'all. So in the comments down below, definitely let me know, what do you think could be changed about these defenders? Because for the longest time there, it felt like defenders was one of the classes that was like the best well flushed out class, and now it kind of feels like the opposite. It feels like defenders have mostly fallen to the sidelines, and you're seeing a lot, mostly prominently, a lot of Wigglytuff and Ninetales filling that defender role coming from the supporter class. So, when you look at characters like Mr. Mime and Wigglytuff, what makes them good tanks, I don't even want to call them defenders because they're not defenders, but what makes them good tanks? Well, Wigglytuff brings an incredible amount of CC. Whether you're going rollout or sing, it doesn't really matter. You're bringing an incredible amount of CC to the table, but also has, some decent damage, with Dazzling Gleam or even just Pound, but the Unite move, I think that's really Wigglytuff's strength. I think Wigglytuff might have the strongest Unite move in the game, or at least one of the strongest Unite moves in the game. As for Mr. Mime has an incredible Unite move, but he also gets Confusion Barrier, which in lane, once you get Confusion, that is just anti-farming. You're stealing, you're doing so much damage, and Mr. Mime brings so much to the table. So it's the farm secure, it really is, I think. But something else I noticed, if you actually look at the stats, the discrepancy between some of the stat lines that are important for like a frontliner between the defender role and the supporters that are being played as defenders is actually kind of surprising, and I've never really paid attention to this until today when I was thinking about this whole thing. So let's take a look really quickly. Snorlax at level 15 has 9899 HP, 580 defense, and 400 SP defense. Now you have Wigglytuff at 9452 HP, 539 defense, and 482 SP defense. So the stat lines for like a tankier frontliner are not even that different. She has a little bit less health, a little bit less defense, but she has 82 more SP defense. Now let's take a look at Mime. I'm pulling it up really quickly. Mime, 9,400 health, 9402 health, 420 defense, and 361. So arguably, much less tanky in terms of defense, but still really high health, pretty decent defense, and has the ability to just be super disruptive. So it's really, really interesting to me to see that these kind of like pseudo tank, pseudo defender supports have such high stat lines, when compared to the tank role, and are actually able to fill that kind of tank category. So I wonder if there's something to be said about maybe increasing the actual tankiness of tanks, and maybe, I don't want to say lowering their damage, but actually just making it so enticing to have a defender on the team just because of the innate tankiness that they bring to the table. So that's been something I've been kind of thinking about. Because even comparing like supporters to the stats of, say, like a Lucario or other all-rounders, they really are not nearly as tanky as some of the supporters are, and I find that to be really interesting. Now, I'm actually really curious. I'm doing this live while I'm recording this. I want to look at Eldegoss. So Eldegoss gets 88,000 HP, 200 defense, and 149 SP defense. So it really is almost like Mr. Mime and Wiggly were designed with the stat line of tanks, but are fitting inside the supporter tree. Now, I personally don't have any issue with like Mime and Wiggly filling the supporter or like the tank role. I think it could easily have been them just being classified as defenders anyway, so I don't really think it matters. But I think in terms of like the optics and the viability of what is classified as the defender role, I would love to see some changes. So friends, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Personally, the only real thought I could come up with is I would actually love to see tanks across the board get like, I don't know, maybe like a 10% buff to their stats in terms of health and defense. That sounds kind of crazy, because I'm definitely not trying to force like a double tank meta or anything like that. But if you had a noticeable reason to take a defender in a game, and like maybe they just scale really, really high, you know, from like level 10 on, level 9 onward, that could be enough of a reason to potentially tough through their early game. So like I said, friends, I would definitely love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Just something I've been thinking about in terms of the viability of defenders and what makes them viable and what doesn't make them viable. I think Mamoswine's creeping up on the meta, and Snorlax is pretty good, but otherwise, the other defenders outside of Greedent kind of living off into his own world, they're just not really that strong. They're not really that viable, and I would love to see some changes. So, as always, friends, be sure to be kind to one another, tell someone that you love them, and I'll see you on the next video.